Welcome to another episode of AndyBTW Rant and Rave Chronicles. That's right, I'm your host, and this is Volume 1 of AndyBTW Rant and Rave Chronicles, The Divorce. Or the Divorce. Here we go. Hey everybody. How's it going? It's me, AndyBTW, or Love Retro BTW. I am doing my first ever, and I'm very excited, AndyBTW Rant and Rave Chronicles, which is specifically just for YouTube. I'm not going to be clipping this out across all my other socials, but if you want to check out all the nostalgia and retrospective stuff I do across social, feel free. This is about different topics that pertain to my life. They could be retro gaming related, like today has retro gaming through lines. Obviously, it's really also a personal story about my life. So I will talk about some things that aren't gaming related, like being a reality TV producer. And we're not going to get to that episode yet. But today I wanted to focus on a really interesting one. A lot of people that know my content might know that I'm a Sega Saturn enthusiast. I was lucky enough to have a Sega Saturn in the US in 1995, during a time when owning a Sega Saturn was, first of all, really expensive, and second of all, very rare. Not a lot of people had one. For instance, I was one of the only people in my friend group that had a Sega Saturn, and I've been wanting desperately to share this story. I've done like snippets of it across, online here and there, but nothing like a video. And I thought this would make the perfect volume 1 of my little, video series, just, talking about really interesting things. And, I know the layout. If you knew my live podcast I used to do called Cafe BTW, this was kind of the layout. So I will be updating a lot of this stuff as we go. That said, I'm really excited to kind of, sure, I'm not live streaming anymore, but at least, bring some personal content to you. And I know big thanks to everyone that's been following me on YouTube. It's been a long time coming, and I'm really excited to do a YouTube channel. But today we're going to talk about how did I get a Sega Saturn in 1995? And that story is seated deeply. But before we get there, I did want to showcase some videos I did, across my socials of some of my Sega Saturn collection. I have over 220 Sega Saturn games, just from basically having them in my childhood all the way to now, and I started recollecting a lot of Sega Saturn games. And I don't have a collecting shelf or wall. We live in a 500 square foot apartment in Los Angeles, but I do have bins, as you can see here, of a lot of my games, and they are with me. So I have a bunch of bins under my bed, and there is a cabinet here with some bins. And this is I was thinking about this meme I made last year, which is me in 1995 when none of my friends but me had a Sega Saturn. It's like, I'm not a meme maker, but it's like speaks volumes to this story that I'm about to share with you. And you're probably wondering, why is it titled The Divorce? The Sega Saturn. Well, because of my parents' divorce, I got a Sega Saturn in 1995. I got a Sega Saturn on release. And let's talk a little bit about my upbringing. I grew up I was born in New York. Both parents, my dad was from Queens, my mom was from Brooklyn. Grew up and went to high school in North Jersey, right outside New York City, kind of like 20 minutes away from the George Washington Bridge, and had a really cool childhood. Went to a really kind of like apple pie type high school. Like I felt like there was the goths, and then there was the cliques, and there was the people that loved, all types of genres. It was like such a apple pie type of high school experience. I don't know. I felt like I was in a movie, like a teen movie or whatever, when I was growing up. But that said, I was very lucky. My mom and dad always bought me video games. And, my parents were married for 17 years. And that was up to the point that I was turning 12 and heading into, I think, 7th grade or 8th grade. And I was one of those kids where my parents' divorce really affected me. And honestly, and I know I'm not alone here, you know, there's still like trinkets of those experiences and traumatic things I witnessed with my mom and my dad breaking up. And my dad actually having an affair with who became my stepmother, who absolutely care about and love now. But back then, you know, when you're a 12-year-old, and I was really just didn't understand the divorce. And, you know, my dad is a great guy, and unfortunately was a great guy. He passed away of cancer about 4 years ago. But he's always been a great dad. And, you know, the divorce does not measure my dad, even though he did have an affair on my mom and, you know, broke up the family or whatnot. But, you know, at the time I was really young. I didn't really understand that maybe my parents didn't love each other anymore. But my dad felt really guilty about this whole thing. And, you know, it really did kind of mess me up a little bit as a kid. I was just confused. And my dad was like, you know, Andy, I want to buy you something out of guilt. And he was really just straight up with me. And he's like, look, let's go to Nobody Beats the Wiz. Are there any video games or consoles out? Like, what do you want? And to go a little bit deeper here, it wasn't that my parents just got divorced and I got a Saturn. They got divorced, and then eventually my dad, who he had an affair with, wanted her to move in with him. So this wasn't a purchase because of the divorce, but because my dad felt guilty and my new future stepmother was going to move into the apartment, the woman that my dad had an affair with, my mom. It was a lot. So my dad's like, is there anything coming out that would make you feel okay if I bought you this? And, you know, look, I'm a young kid. I'm not going to turn my dad down when he wants to buy me something. So I said, it was literally like, I think a week or two where the Saturn had announced it was coming out sooner. And that was a whole nother story and a kind of like a marketing mess for the US. But I was like, Dad, there's this thing called the Sega Saturn. It's like the newest high-tech console or whatever. And it costs $400. And back then, $400 in 1995, that was not cheap. Okay. People complain about video game prices now. That console price was very expensive. Now, what's really funny, in the Northeast area, there was a store that kind of like, if you want to think about it as a Best Buy type place, it had everything. It was called Nobody Beats the Wiz. And in my area, it was common that Joe Namath was their spokesperson, you know, Hall of Famer, Broadway Joe. So I wanted to show everyone a commercial so you can understand the place my dad ended up buying the Sega Saturn at, with a little Joe Namath touch.
Everyone can learn something from their dad. How to throw a football, drive a car, or even how to run a business. The man who founded Nobody Beats the Wiz taught his children always satisfy their customer. Be totally honest, strive for excellence in everything you do, and respect yourselves and others.
That's right, Joe.
Today, his children are running the Wiz, just the way their father taught them, with integrity, excellence, and respect for their customers. Nobody beats the Wiz.
So that was the famous saying, nobody beats the Wiz, you know? And you might recognize the sign, the photo here. This was like the atypical sign of the Wiz. Also really funny, if you watch Seinfeld, that was the Wiz guy or whatever, who I believe was Arnie from Pete and Pete. You know, write in the comments, am I right with that? I think I totally am. That is totally Arnie, the strongest man in the world. That said, Nobody Beats the Wiz is where we bought the Sega Saturn. And it's really just so interesting because I remember it like it was yesterday. I'll put on these commercials in the background. I remember it like it was yesterday. So my dad's like, okay, you want the Sega Saturn? It's $400. I remember he, you know, gave it a little bit of a wiped his forehead and was like, pulled up his pants. It's like, fine, let's go. And we went down to the Paramus Nobody Beats a Whiz, which was behind the Garden State Plaza in Paramus off of Route 17. And actually, it's still there, but it's not the Whiz anymore. I think it's empty. It used to be a Best Buy, but I think it's empty, but it's still there. It's like behind the mall in the parking lot area. And I remember walking in, and to this day, it was really like such a memory. The guy was standing on a high counter, and there was really expensive electronics behind him locked up. And my dad's like, what was that thing, Andy, that you wanted? And I said, the Sega Saturn. And the guy was like, oh, the Sega Saturn. Yeah, we have 3 in stock. He's like, let me go grab it for you. And I remember he pulled it out and had that like white box that it's known to be in that original release. And he put it on the counter. And I was still kind of short. You know, I wasn't that tall. And not that I'm a tall guy. I'm like an average height. But I remember looking at it from this high, like it was like a high counter. And the guy was high up because he was standing on top there. I remember this. And I'm just looking at the box, and my dad looks at me like my dad does, and he goes, is this it? I said, yeah, this is it. And like, I was so happy that we were buying it. So he bought it, and long story short, it was in my, the only stipulation was I lived with my mom, and I would go to my dad's every other weekend. So I could only play the Sega Saturn at my dad's house, you know, obviously until I got older and eventually took all my original Saturn stuff. But I still remember the last tidbit of this whole like cycle is when my stepmom, my future stepmom, and who my dad had an affair with, moved into the apartment. I still remember the Saturn was sitting out in the living room attached to the main living room TV, because my dad had a really cool like Sony CRT or whatever, pretty big. And I remember her like walking over to it and like pressing the seat, you know, the casing, and it would like open up like from the top, and then she just like kind of like shrugged and walked away. And it was kind of this interesting like closure to the whole loop. But yeah, and that's the interesting story about how I actually got a Sega Saturn in 1995, not because of any like reason of, you know, just like saving my money or I got it for a birthday present. It was because my dad felt guilty. One, that he had an affair with my mom and broke up our family. And also the woman he had the affair with became my stepmother, who I love. And that's the story. And I thought it was the perfect Rant and Rave Chronicles, and a perfect volume 1. There's a lot more stories about my life, and I'm really excited to share them with everybody. That said, that's it. There's not much more to it, and you know, there's no time frame on these episodes. So I'm just glad to share it with everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the story. It's part tragic, but also beautiful in so many ways. And why the Sega Saturn just means so much to me. It's more than just a console. It was literally a part of my upbringing in a very powerful way. And that's it. I'm Andy. Love Retro BTW across socials. I can't wait to do the next one. There's really no timeline when these come out, but I have a good idea on what volume 2 is going to be. But until next time, hang around the YouTubes. Check out my content. Love Retro BTW across other channels. And until next time, I'm Andy. And this is AndyBTW, Rant and Rave Chronicles. See you next time.